Welcome back to another Tumblr deep dive, because this is my brand now, I guess. Sarah Z, I swear I'm not trying to jump all over your territory. Please, I have your mug. Please don't smite me with your powerful analytical gaze. You might have noticed that John Green left Twitter this week. You might have also heard tale of how he was bullied off of Tumblr a few years ago. If you haven't, and even if you have, let's talk about why, and how that relates back to something I've been wanting to talk about for a while. John Green being bullied off the site is a big part of the Tumblr mythos. I swear this channel isn't entirely talking about Tumblr and K-dramas. I do have other videos planned, but we'll get to those. Also, the next one is probably going to be a really long deep dive into something K-drama related and adjacent, so I'm really digging my own grave here. Anyway, we constantly joke about Tumblr being the site that bullied John Green so hard he left. And the main thing that people reference from that time is the infamous monologue that it's too early in the video to say the name of. I do it too. Hell, I mentioned it in my video about Tumblr culture. But when I actually pulled up the monologue to use as a reference image in that video, I realised it had been a very long time since I'd actually read it. And it's a lot worse than I remembered. Important context for this is that for a period of time, John Green was Tumblr's golden girl. He was one of the few major celebrities on the site, and to top it all off, he was the author of a number of books that did very well within the Tumblr demographic. Fault in Our Stars, and Looking for Alaska, and Paper Towns were extremely popular on Tumblr, due to them being relatable for everyone from neurodivergent teenagers to mentally ill adults, and just generally fans of romance. It was the peak of the early YA fiction frenzy, and John Green was right there in the trenches with us, answering asks and passing comment on random things just like we all would, and it made his fans feel more connected to him than if they just followed him on Twitter or Instagram. He wasn't just a writer though, he was a critical thinker, somebody who liked to discuss politics and real-world issues and stood up for what was right. He spoke about his neurodivergence openly, he's a feminist and supported queer rights and did his best to stay educated on all the issues that were brought to him. The worst things he ever did on the site were misspeak or be misinformed about something, after which he would always apologise, and sometimes when he didn't need to. Sure, he was a bit cringe, but who wasn't back then? He was a Tumblr girly. One of the best. And then everything went tits up. This was back when tits were allowed on Tumblr, of course. Early 2010s internet culture was interesting, to say the least. Entire sections of society were meeting in huge numbers for the first time and clashing violently, and this was especially true of somewhere like Tumblr, which was a bit of a free-for-all at the time. And yet, despite having free reign to do and post whatever they liked, there was a weird rise in an almost evangelical purity culture. And it was slowly taking over the site. People who considered themselves to be righteous, upstanding members of society were suddenly being confronted with racism, misogyny, homophobia, and a whole host of other things that aren't necessarily being said aloud out in the real world. And this caused a shift in their own behaviour. They started moving wildly in the opposite direction. Too wildly. Wait, no, we're reaching critical velocity! Thus the SJW was born. The image that just popped into your head of a teenage white girl with blue hair and entitled attitude, that originated on Tumblr. Not the term, that's definitely a Twitter, Reddit, Gamergate-based co-opting of a positive sentiment, but the colloquial image that accompanies that term. When those Twitter bros were throwing that term around, they meant people on Tumblr. And because history is cyclical and there are like 4 themes, you may have noticed that with the rise of TikTok, that same purity culture rhetoric is surging among teenagers again, which is just great. Cancel culture as a term has been twisted and changed so much that it has a completely different meaning depending on who you ask nowadays. Look forward to my 10-part miniseries on words we are overusing and destroying the meaning of in the future, because I'm making a list. And guess how many of them show up in this video, because it's more than one. But ostensibly, it's applying, and often misapplying, a morality or ethics to punish somebody for something you consider a misdeed. This misdeed can be anything from an actual crime to a misinterpretation of something somebody said. And in all cases, the idea is to shun the person for their actions, to excommunicate them from society. What this actually does, in a lot of cases, is give people an excuse to be as nasty as possible to another human being without feeling guilty. Because they did something bad. So it's okay that I'm anonymously sending them death threats or doxing them or tweeting at them 24 hours a day. As Midnight's SDL pointed out in their post about the situation, people were dehumanizing someone for the express purpose of justifying whatever pain and suffering you want to inflict upon them. Basically deciding, this person is bad, so I am exempt from affording them basic respect and human decency, and I am allowed to cross any and all otherwise uncrossable lines in order to punish them without damaging my own moral or ethical standing. In this case, that meant that a huge number of Tumblr users took issue with John Green for reasons, and used that as an excuse to shit all over him. It was like people felt they had to justify their hatred or dislike of him for being cringe, or just for no reason at all, and in order to justify that negative feeling, they made it his problem. What were those reasons, you ask? Apparently, writing YA books makes you a groomer. This is the second word on the list of words people are woefully overusing until they lose all meaning list, by the way. An adult male celebrity just engaging with his teenage girl fans isn't grooming. Just like drag show story times aren't grooming. And yet, people decided that because John Green was so open with his fans about his life, beliefs, and neurodivergency, and that he wrote books aimed largely at teenage girls, that was predatory. Despite the fact that Tumblr as a site was predicated on oversharing, because he was doing it wrong, whatever that means, it opened a door for people to start talking to him a certain way, making call-out posts about him with long lists of receipts that were usually predicated on opinion or easily refutable evidence. His books started to be over-scrutinized by people who'd never even read them, using their inaccurate opinions of said books as more fuel to add to the criticism that was already overblown, and it eventually escalated into something untenable. Like, you may remember one of the main criticisms around this time being that, is it Paper Towns or Alaska? One of them was like a manic pixie dream girl. I think it's Paper Town. Everyone kept talking about how, like, oh, of course, typical man writing a manic pixie dream girl. The entire point of that book was that, like, it's written from the perspective of a teenage boy who thinks he's found a manic pixie dream girl and then discovers that, like, that's not how that works at all. It's the same criticism that gets levied at 500 Days of Summer by people who haven't seen 500 Days of Summer. It's like both of those things are like damning indictments of the manic pixie dream girl thing. But anyway, the twisted combination of purity culture and the rise of cancel culture created an environment where not only was it acceptable to do some truly awful shit to a person, but it was actually encouraged. Because we've all heard of the cock monologue. We've all joked about the cock monologue, but we all seem to have erased from our collective memories, especially people like me in their early 20s who were teenagers when this was all happening, that this was not even close to the worst of it. And even the monologue is worse than I remembered. I definitely didn't remember it being this graphic or this weird. In my head, it was basically the first 2 lines and then just a blur of text until I reread it a few weeks ago. This is uncomfortable. And it's also predicated on a kind of homophobic joke. The idea that, haha, a man likes penis. That's so funny because men aren't supposed to do that. Like, if you saw this post in the wild today on Tumblr with no context for the John Green stuff at all, you wouldn't think it was a joke post because people on this site unironically say stuff like this now, and there's a lot less of that purity culture thing going around. But as I said, the purity culture was almost evangelical. So it was fine to call John Green a groomer for checks notes, writing books, and use that as an excuse to project homosexuality onto him so they could then degrade him for it. It's sexual harassment, and you can say I'm over-exaggerating, but imagine this kind of shit happening to you on an innocuous post you wrote. Imagine how uncomfortable you'd feel seeing something you said being crossed out and written over until you were being called gay as an excuse to be cruel. But it wasn't the worst of it. John Green was accused, with absolutely no evidence, by posts that reached thousands of notes of being a groomer, a pedophile, a liar who only pretended to be neurodivergent for clout, and even escalated to somehow calling him a Nazi, because people have no idea what actual Nazism is. Speaking of, Kanye West is a Nazi. That's not up for debate. As Midnight's SDL said, once the John Green hate party reached a certain level of critical mass, it became less about who he actually was or what he'd done, and more about proving you were a good person by hating him. That's the natural conclusion of cancel culture, after all, virtue signaling by identifying yourself in opposition to the cancelled parties. They're bad and I'm good, so I hate them. Or more often, they're bad and I hate them, so I'm good. People started editing his post to say things he wouldn't endorse, which is where the infamous cock monologue comes from. As an aside, that's insane, by the way, that Tumblr just had a feature that at one point let you do that, edit other people's posted posts. Insane. The thing that eventually actually pushed him to leave was that somebody sent him a picture of his own house. People were doxing him on the SJW cringe site and making him feel unsafe. People who in their heads were trying to create a safe space were doing that by making it unsafe for somebody else. He left for the sake of not only his own mental health, because being bombarded by that kind of vitriol every day can break a person, but also for his physical safety. And because there was no point in staying on the site to interact with his fans anymore when it was impossible to see them through the charging mob. And then it sort of faded away once he'd gone. I was on the site during this, and my main understanding of it was that somebody edited his post into the cock monologue, and then he left. The people who participated in the vitriol just got to walk away and do it to somebody else with no accountability. They didn't introspect afterwards, at least not publicly. They couldn't acknowledge that what they did was baseless, homophobic, and cruel, because the whole point of the purity mob was that we were cancelling somebody for being bad, and homophobia and cruelty and bullying are bad, so we can't possibly be a part of that. But knowing the buzzwords and actually putting them into effect are different things. To borrow Midnight SDL's words again, thank you, by the way. Everybody should go read this post in full, it's really good. Yet even now, with the benefit of hindsight, and even among those who ostensibly reject purity culture and condemn bullying and harassment, very few on Tumblr take what was done to John Green as seriously as it should be taken, or condemn it as thoroughly as it should be condemned, which I think is something we need to at least consider doing. Given the increasing rise of purity and cancel culture online, again, and given the recent influx of professional creators eager to interact with fans on a more direct level than they have on other social media. Because it's happening again. I mean, it's happened countless times since to celebrities big and small and internet guys of the week, but what I mean is that this environment and culture is emerging again. John Green left Twitter this week precisely because these insane accusations with no proof got brought back up again. Because Twitter has become a free-for-all of hate speech, and people are using that as an excuse to take their personal grievances and make them justifiable for the public. This isn't helped by the rising purity culture among teenagers on TikTok, where any mention of sex is suddenly worthy of scrutiny, any queer representation must be perfect, any person we admire mustn't ever slip from the pedestal or they deserve to be stoned. I mean, not to quote the Bible, but he who has never sinned, throw the first stone. We've all done stupid shit. We've all said things we didn't mean. Hell, we've all said things we meant and then realized they were wrong in hindsight. We're all still educating ourselves on the right way to be every day. Lindsay Ellis spoke on every single one of her controversies, and she was still bullied off social media. The whole point of this culture is to hold people accountable for their actions, but when they hold themselves accountable, we tell them it's still not good enough, and we keep throwing stones until they have no choice but to run and hide. And at least celebrities have some kind of a support system in place. Not always, but in a large number of cases, they have a team of people to deflect criticism, or if they don't, then they at least have the money to fall back on when they want to retreat from the world for a while. It's much more worrying in this day and age because it can happen to anyone. People pick a person of the week on TikTok to dunk on, and then thousands of people go over there on their high horses and tear them to shreds for the crime of being cringe. Because even a small level of visibility seems to give people permission to engage in systemic harassment. But you should have known you'd get hate once your video got that many views. Okay. But how was I supposed to guarantee it got that many views when it never had before? How am I, a random person just existing and trying to have fun on the internet, equipped to deal with a hate mob when that's never been something I had to worry about before? I have 1,500 followers on Tumblr, which is not that many. It's a chunk. It's good. I love it. I love all my followers, but like it's not big in the grand scheme of things. And even I managed to collect a few anonymous haters who would comment on my fanfics, send me nasty anons, and worst of all, send my friends nasty anonymous messages with baseless accusations about me as a person. I'm not famous. I'm not a public figure. I'm just a random person on the internet that they decided was bad, which gave them free license to be as cruel to me as they wanted. It seems to have died down recently, but there's no guarantee they won't show back up again, or that putting myself out there on YouTube like this won't amass a new group of people who decide they're allowed to be as nasty as possible to me because I deserve it for the crime of whatever they can use to justify it. I know people on this site and Tumblr and Twitter who have been harassed, stalked, doxed, sent death threats, and a whole host of other horrific things just for the crime of admitting they liked one band or show more than another, or misspoke around an important issue, or in the case of John Green, wrote some fucking books. And to this day, it's been watered down and twisted until we've forgotten how bad it was. We bullied John Green off Tumblr with a cock monologue is hilarious, until it isn't. Because it's not the whole story. We bullied John Green off of Tumblr with baseless accusations and queerphobic harassment and doxing. And I'm including myself in that we, even though I wasn't a part of it, because if we keep letting these things slide and painting over them after the fact with jokes and nonsense, then we become complicit. John, if you ever see this, I'm sorry that all happened to you. I hope you're having a much better time far away from social media. And to everybody else, think before you act. Accusations are one thing, but they are not an excuse to bully someone, especially if they're backed up with no facts at all. Just because you read something about someone you don't like, you can't use that as an excuse to justify your dislike of them to yourself if there is no evidence for those claims. You're allowed to just dislike a person. You don't need a reason for it, but you also don't need to jump down their throat about it either. We can do better. We have to do better. Or the Elons and the Trumps and the right-wing assholes of the world win. The whole point of a safe space is to make the space safe. I don't even have a fun outro for this one. I'm just, like, annoyed. And the anonymous hate thing gets to me because it started when I was on the other side of that purity culture thing. I was part of a group of people who really didn't like kink fic and dark fic, as they call it on Tumblr. And it wasn't all kinks, it was very particularly damaging kinks, like Lolita stuff and grooming and child abuse. Grooming used in the actual correct way. I took a stand against some of the fanfics in my community that were written in a way that I felt was romanticizing grooming. I didn't necessarily want those fics taken down because I don't think we should be censoring other people's right to free speech, but also it is my right to free speech to then talk loudly about how I disagree with those things. I didn't incite violence against those people, I didn't send death threats to those people. I just wanted to ask questions and I wanted to work out why this was something that anybody wanted to read. In doing so, thousands of people agreed with me in the wrong direction and did start being quite cruel to those other people. And so from that, I amassed like an army of people who I'd never met, who I had no idea what was going on, who I didn't know had started this stuff, rise up against me for expressing my opinion. And like neither side should have had to deal with those anonymous threats and that anonymous violence and anonymous lies being made up about you. That's horrible. You should exist. I mean, this seems ridiculous to say on the internet, but arguments should exist within the facts. And it didn't. It very quickly didn't. It very quickly devolved into just mudslinging. And that's gross. And long after the situation was over a year after the situation had been put to bed, I still had these people coming into my DMs, coming into my friends' DMs and being like, oh, have you heard about Talis? She's a plagiarist, she's a groomer, she's a piece of shit, she's done this and this and this and this. And it's like, luckily they were saying that to my friends who like knew me outside of Tumblr, who actually do know me well enough to know that I had done none of those things. But imagine them sending ask to that to people who are just my Tumblr friends, who don't know anything about me, who are just going to take that at face value and believe it because you said you have receipts, even though you're not showing receipts. Like, people can just say something and people will take that as a receipt. Girl, we need to learn what receipts are. Good God. I feel bad for John Green because like that could be any of us. I feel bad for Lindsay Ellis because that could be any of us. I feel bad for people like Sarah Z who on Tumblr and on YouTube and on Twitter gets people all the time like assuming things about her and then talking about them loudly to anyone who will listen until there's whole corners of the internet that believe shit about her that just isn't true. It's just so uncomfortable. It's such a weird way that we've just decided society should work. It's schoolyard bullying on a massive international scale, and it's gross. And we all deserve better than that. So yeah, okay, the cock monologue is funny in a vacuum, but even in a vacuum, it's just gross. I don't even have an outro for this one. I'm just frustrated.